Press record.
Greetings and salutations. UFC 280 is in the books. It is Sunday, October 23rd. I am Spencer Kyte. He is Harry Powell, and these are the next day takeaways. It's the first time you and I have done this in a while. It feels like it's been a really long time. I've been sick. I've been on holiday. It just hasn't lined up. It's just been I've been trying to adopt dogs. Many things have interfered with you and I sitting down to discuss fights. But we are here, and we are here to discuss. Interesting. UFC 280, which took place yesterday in Abu Dhabi at Etihad Arena. And we were saying off air, we were saying yesterday, even during the live stream, and we'll start here, that this was one of those fight cards where through the opening half, it felt very pedestrian. It felt very just general fight card. That buzz that we felt at the very start of the day, when it was finally here, when we were finally getting this card, dissipated very quickly, and it felt like a bit of a slog until we got to Bilal Muhammad. And then from there, it was just take flight. Very similar, as I said on the stream, to UFC 189 in Las Vegas. Memorable to everybody for Rory McDonald and Robbie Lawler, Conor McGregor and Chad Mendez, where the first series of fights, the first 5 fights in that card, all went to a decision. And then it was just banger after banger. Now that we've had a day to decompress, a day to process, what are your general overall takeaways from just this card itself?
So I think there is an element with which we are sidelining on a spectrum. And that spectrum is that on one hand, we seem to be talking more negatively about fight night cards than we ever have. And then we look at a pay-per-view like this, and maybe we overblow the pay-per-view slightly. I feel like because that main card was so rich and so dense in its storylines and in its fervor and in its matchmaking, that we then sort of forget that there's an undercard and that the undercard may not live up in quite the hype to a main card. Now, if we look ahead to UFC 281, I feel like that's a far more well-rounded card top to bottom, and there are far more fights with interesting storylines throughout the night. But I think you're right that there, in actuality, as the undercard played out, people were like, oh, this isn't what I expected. This isn't what was marketed to me. And I think we all sort of fell into that trap a little bit, because when we got to the main card, and obviously Bilal and Brady, it was banger after banger after banger. However, how we got there, I think was less than expected, and we're all at fault for that.
Right. We had to sit through Armin Petrosyan and AJ Dobson. We had to sit through Abubakar Nurmagomedov and Gaziomir Gadziev and so on and so forth. It's interesting that you mention off the top sort of the frustration and disappointment in general with fight night cards, which is something we talk about regularly, both on this show and the preview show and just in general. And it feels to me like that's sort of very much what contributes to this, right? So we get this top heavy card. We get this card that is the final 6 fights are all tremendous. Each one of them could be a main event in and of itself. And then we sort of just get wrapped up in that and forget that there's other things and expect it to just be great from the get-go, when really that's difficult. Now, we've seen cards where we've had exciting performances throughout. We had a card earlier this year where it was all finishes. Now, finishes doesn't even necessarily mean that it's an exciting card, right? One of the finishes on that was Juju Miller and Brogan Walker Sanchez Walker. Brogan Sanchez, I think she's dropped the Brogan Walker. I think she's dropped the Sanchez. Regardless, it wasn't a particularly entertaining fight until it still ended being a finish, which continued the narrative. And so I think for me, as someone who often advocates for the totality of cards and previews cards in full depth, I felt very aware of what was coming and that it was going to be a let's get to these last 6, and that's where it gets really good. I was interested in some of the earlier stuff, but my expectations were certainly not that they were going to be of the same level of the final 6. And I think, as you said, this was marketed or held out as or looked at as this is just going to be nonstop. And truthfully, very few fight cards, very few UFC events are ever that way. How do we mitigate against that going forward? You mentioned 281. You and I have talked offline. Probably a better card top to bottom overall. How do we avoid that same pitfall of way too hyped and then come away feeling disappointed early heading into that one at Madison Square Garden?
I mean, I don't think that we can. And equally, like, this is kind of what I'm thinking about the over marketing of the card, is that if you just market the card properly, then people don't get overblown. And actually, Arman Petrosian versus Yaman Dobson, I've forgotten his first name, I apologize to him, is a fine fight, actually. In actuality, it was a fine fight. And Muhammad Makayev had a fine fight. And some of the other people on the undercard that I've already forgotten, which I guess kind of talks to what we're saying. But like, there wasn't fights there that you were like, oh, Jesus, this is rough. Or you weren't saying like, this is a horrendous fight like we may see on a fight night.
Right. There wasn't Roman Dolidze and Trevin Giles.
Right.
Where it's just 15 minutes of nothing is happening. And can we please hurry up and move forward? They were still entertaining, competitive. They just weren't the, oh my God, splash that everybody was told was coming.
Right. And how do we avoid this? It's difficult because the UFC machine at the moment is a marketing machine. It always has been a marketing machine, right? But I think now more than ever, there are more dollars behind the marketing because the marketing is far slicker and there is better posters and there is better YouTube and there is 4K quality on the YouTube and there is better Instagram reels and there is better fan interaction and there is all of these things that you would expect from a multi-billion pound consumerist company. They are putting the dollars behind their marketing and it is showing. Whether the angle of that marketing could be changed slightly, I don't know. Maybe the way that you do that is you build up some of the fighters on the undercard. Obviously, Muhammad Makayev does a fantastic amount of self-promotion. Maybe you build up Malcolm Gordon a little bit. Maybe you build up a Karol Hossa. Maybe you build up, name X or Y that's entering here. And then it gives the fight a sort of a larger feel, because at the end of the day, what's the reason why we buy into these fight cards? Is it just skill alone? No, it's not. It's also jeopardy in the fights, and I'm stealing a Graham McDonald word there, but it's jeopardy in the fights because there's meaning behind them. They mean something to us. They mean something to the characters with which are portrayed in the octagon. Sean O'Malley Piotr Jan is a perfect example of that. Yes, it is highly skilled fighting. And as we went in, and I think this is important to note, Sean and Graham said this on the big podcast, and I'll repeat it here. We went in there, and me included, on my one-man booth, said there is a high chance that Piotr Jan goes in and shows that Sean O'Malley is not at the level that he says he is. He came in and said, fuck all of you. I am exactly as good as you think, as I think I am. Hats off. He's right. I was wrong. Did he do the things that I said he needed to do in order to win the fight? He did some of them. He absolutely did some of the fighting things. And I'm really pleased that he did them, because what's happened is the man has started to elevate the skills to which his character is. And going into that fight, people cared about the Sean O'Malley story. They cared about him winning or him losing, depending on which side of the fence you were on, less about the skills of him fighting. And I think that when we look at the card, that main card overall, and obviously Bilal and Brady, there are storylines, there are characters, there's investment in those fights. There's no reason why we couldn't be invested in an Arman Petrosian versus somebody Dobson fight. There's no reason why we couldn't be invested in a Karol Hossa or, you know, anyone else on the undercard in the same way that we're invested in Muhammad Mokaev. So I think that marketing is the answer to both of these questions.
First name is AJ, by the way.
Thank
AJ
you.
Dobson, Contender Series graduate.
Two-letter fucking name. I apologize, Mr. Dobson.
I do agree with you that marketing is part of it. And this is a thing that we talk about a lot. Lots of people speak about quite frequently, right? This feels like part of because the schedule is so hectic, it's very difficult to get people to know and follow and buy into all the names that are on this card. Now, the pushback I will have is that Caio Borralho has been on 2 main cards this year in his first 2 fights. He had his Contender Series moments. He's someone that people should already know his story a little bit. Nikita Krylov and Volkan Ozdemir, we don't really need to tell you a story about these two. We don't really need to sell it. They've been around. You know who they are. The quality is there. Some of the other fighters, that then to me sort of just leaves 4 fights. And as much as I want everyone to pay attention to everyone and know a little something about everyone and spend my weeks here on SevereMMA going through top to bottom, I fully understand if you go into the first 3 or 4 fights of a night, no matter whether it's this card or the card coming up on Sunday, not really familiar with those people. The job in that moment, though, is to get you invested in those people, whether that's through what you tell us going in or what they do inside the cage or what they tell us afterwards. And that seems to be the part that is missing a little bit at times. Now, some of that is just on the athletes, right? Not everybody can be a Sean O'Malley that goes out there and draws you in. And so I think for me, it's always been a little bit of, we kind of just want a little bit too much. Just a little bit, like not a lot, I don't think people are overly, like there's just that little bit, right? Everybody says, well, it's very hard to pay attention, but then they want the UFC to be able to market everyone. Well, those two things don't work together. Like it's impossible for those two. It's very difficult for those things to work together.
Do you not think it's not an expectation, but it's what we've become accustomed to being marketed to, you know?
No, I don't think it is. I mean, when's the last time that you looked at a fight card and how long ago was it that you looked at a fight card and truly knew everybody, or like looked at a fight card and thought, I'm familiar with every name on here or 1/2 of every pairing on here, and I'm invested in this card top to bottom. Like everybody talks about the way that these cards have become watered down and the schedule has made it. Well, the schedule has been 36 to 42 fights for a decade. This isn't new anymore. This isn't fresh. And so the thing that's changed, in my opinion, is that the time investment, energy investment, focus investment of fans, coupled with the UFC dialing back who they're marketing, they're shrinking to a smaller number of people because the market seems to only care about a smaller number of people. And so you're not going to commit scores of dollars to promoting a bunch of people that you're repeatedly being told don't matter to the public. And so it's a weird dichotomy that I mean, look, I'm always the guy that argues this side of it. And so I certainly do see the other side of it, but I'd really love, like, this is one of the conversations I would love to sit down and have 6 of us on this screen as I point at my screen, like just have a large conversation of people that are willing to have the conversation, not yell, not argue, not call each other shitheads, but have this conversation, because I'd really love to know how we got here, how we get out of it, where we go going forward.
Maybe that's the speaker's corner.
Maybe that's the speaker's corner.
Because I feel like I would need time to formulate some real opinions on that. I have feelings.
I would like to sit down and make notes as well. We can table this for now and move to the main event.
Mm-hmm.
Islam Makhachev wins the vacant UFC lightweight title. 2nd round submission win over Charles Oliveira by arm triangle. One of the big questions going in was how will Makhachev compete at this level against elite competition? It's the first time he's fought a top 10 fighter. Well, he passed that test pretty well. What did that fight, what did that performance tell you about Islam Makhachev and his prospects for holding on to this title going forward?
So I think it cemented what we might have already thought. I think if you watch enough fighting, and I've said this before on this podcast, and I probably said this on other podcasts also, there's an essence to a fighter. There's a way they move their body. There's a way that they portray themselves from a body language perspective. There's a way that they speak. And then there's the form with which they throw their techniques or use their body that just tells you something about them. There's a naturality to it. There's a fluidity to it when you're watching certain fighters. And you got to see from almost day dot with Islam Makhachev that he was good, and he was real good. The question that we had to answer was just how good. And of course, he was built correctly, and he was built under the guise of his now coach and teammate being the champion whilst he was coming up in that division. And there was going to be some difficulty because by the time Khabib was looking at retiring, Islam Makhachev was already knocking on the door of a massive fight, if not a fight away from a title shot. Now, in terms of him keeping the title, I think there are some very interesting stylistic matchups there for him. I was not impressed with Charles Oliveira's round one. I was not super impressed with the way Charles Oliveira chose to enact himself in the first round, let alone the fight. And I feel like there are some intangible psychological and philosophical battles that you have that are non-violent, and Charles Oliveira seemed to lose those earlier and seemed to lose them rather than Islam Makhachev forcing him to lose them. And that's not me, by the way, saying that Charles Oliveira quit or that he's weak or any of these things. I just think that either the game plan didn't work or that he was as delusional about his jiu-jitsu as we may have thought he was. And my argument for that is in round one, he got to a body lock against Islam Makhachev and pulled guard. I don't understand. And I'm not saying that pulling guard is bad. I think there's potentially a time and a place for it. We saw Mackenzie Dern versus Yan Zhuanan. She wasn't able to get the takedown in more traditional ways. So she just pulled De La Riva and swept Yan Zhuanan from there and then did the things. Fine. If you're able to pull guard safely and there's such a discrepancy in grappling there, fine. But we talked about this in the preview show. We talked about this off air. We talked about this ad nauseum on the live stream. That there is a difference in MMA between using jiu-jitsu as a offensive tool in transitions and just the gargantuan difference between the schools of grappling. A jiu-jitsu school is dead in the face of an overarching wrestling, top positional, wrist ride, thigh ride, ankle ride type game. It is the antidote. It is the antithesis to a jiu-jitsu based game. And I feared going in that Charles Oliveira was going to be delusional in his ability to get his jiu-jitsu working. And it felt as though he was.
I also wonder too, and we may not ever get an answer to this. Granted, next time I ask Charles Oliveira anything, next time I communicate with him for an interview, it will be one of my questions. It almost felt to me in watching it that he just a little bit, not underestimated Islam Makhachev, but got out there and went, this guy's way better than I thought. This guy's faster. He's stronger. He's more adept on the feet than I was giving him credit for. This isn't going to be Dustin Poirier, Michael Chandler, Justin Gaethje. I'm in thick here, and I don't necessarily know where to go because of what you just said, right? Because that avenue, and we saw it, right? The finishing sequence of this fight starts extremely familiar to recent Charles Oliveira fights. He gets hit, he gets dropped, and he's on the canvas. In the last two fights against Dustin Poirier and Justin Gaethje, they back up and go, no, man, I want no part of that. And Islam Makhachev was like, wicked, let's go. Punches him again and is straight into an arm triangle. And so I do wonder if there is that little piece of not underestimating, not discrediting his skills, but then get out there and he's actually even better than you thought he was.
I feel like it's not even a skills thing. I actually think it's a philosophical thing. I feel like he's gone out there with his game plan, and when he's locked up with him, he's realized,
this shit ain't gonna work.
This might not work. And I also think that it's almost like an ethereal, non-verbal, non-violent thing where it's even just from the range that the guys were fighting at. Charles Oliveira comes out with a flying front kick, and Islam just slides out of the way and is like, cool. All right, I guess. Fucking weirdo. And then
completely unbothered by everything.
Right. And I think that fear factor, it's almost a self-fulfilling prophecy. Charles Oliveira believes that his grappling is the X factor. His submission skills are the X factor. His sweeping skills are the X factor. And he talks about it. And when he fights Justin Gaethje, Dustin Poirier, Michael Chandler, fighter XYZ, they're like, fuck me, this guy's really good at the jiu-jitsu things. Maybe I should be wary of the jiu-jitsu things. And then when he goes in there and almost unconsciously communicates with Islam Makhachev and asks him the question, like, how do you feel about this aggressive striking because of my jiu-jitsu? And Islam just chuckles and smashes him with the right hand. And then there's panic, right? Like it must be panic because Charles Oliveira is then like, okay, well, I'm about to be deconstructed to the fibers of my being. And guess what that is? Jiu-jitsu. And Islam's still chuckling internally. And then when Charles Oliveira goes back to his brain, there's the monkey from The Simpsons that was in Homer's brain just smashing the symbols together, right? I mean, this is a scary, scary position to be in. When you realize that not only is your A game this reckless, and I don't mean reckless disrespectfully either, this reckless, confident striking game is not going to work because actually you've cracked him a few times and he's actually just cracked you back, if not harder. That you then lock up with him and you realize that as soon as you're starting to pull guard, he's entirely comfortable with what's happening here. That's scary as fuck.
I don't want to spend a lot of time on it. We had Alexander Volkanovski called out and then enter the octagon. That, for all intents and purposes, is the next fight for the lightweight title. Early thoughts on that fight?
Size is a massive thing.
Agreed.
You know, I can't remember who said it. It may have been you. I don't know. But somebody was mentioning that Charles Oliveira looked massive at the weigh-ins in comparison to Islam Makhachev. And then when Islam Makhachev got into the cage, people were like, ooh, we on the live stream were like, he looks like a big boy. He's a big boy. And, you know, even Volkanovski just stood next to him in the cage. The size difference is apparent. And that's, you know, that is a rehydrated Alexander Volkanovski and that's a rehydrated Islam Makhachev. So that's a similar size to what the boys would be fighting at. I don't doubt that
Volk will probably be a few pounds lighter.
Sure.
He looks like he's been enjoying the Cooking with Volk show as of late. But yes, generally speaking, we saw a good representation of what that's going to look like.
Right.
And Islam is bigger.
And Islam
considerably.
Is bigger. And I'm not in any way, shape, or form downplaying the comments that he made afterwards of Charles Oliveira. You know, Islam Makhachev struggled to keep Charles Oliveira down. And I mean, I think struggled maybe a slight hyperbolic term, but I understand what he's meaning. It wasn't the domination that we've seen of other fighters where they look glued to the ground. And look, I mean, this is Charles Oliveira at the end of the day. His off balances and his space making are pretty fucking good. And his point is, you're not going to hold me down that easily. I'm going to get back up and it's going to be a stand-up war. And I think that that is an interesting prospect because we know how good Alexander Volkanovski is. We know how good his offensive striking is, his defensive striking, his striking going backwards, his striking cutting angles, his striking switching, his just all over the place. His striking is fantastic. But the grappling game of Islam Makhachev is scary. And it's scary because of just how dominant it is. And the other thing I will say about Islam Makhachev is he has such a synergy with Khabib because you hear like the rest of the coaching team are sat down very quiet. Khabib is stood up basically in the fucking cage screaming instructions at Islam. And you can see Islam like just nodding his head as he does exactly what he's told. And he's played like a fucking computer game. And that is a very, very scary synergy because so many fighters talk about when I'm in there, it's just me in there. Kinda. Because, I mean, yes, 100%, it's just you in there. It's just you taking the damage. It's just you doing the things. But when you have a separate pair of eyes that are as skilled and as knowledgeable and as aware and as in-depthly, that's not a word, but as connected in depth to your game as Khabib is, that is an invaluable resource. And he can see angles of the fight that you cannot see because he can see behind Charles Oliveira. He can see what's happening and you can feel him, but there are things that he will see that you will not. And that's invaluable, invaluable information. And I don't know many other fighters in the UFC that have a synergy with their coach quite that rich.
It's a fascinating fight. I'm looking forward to it. I don't necessarily like it as the next matchup, and we'll get to some of that discussion in the future here. But we'll move on for now to the co-main event. Bantamweight title fight. Aljamain Sterling defends his title with a second round technical knockout win over TJ Dillashaw. It very well could just read TKO injury or TKO doctor stoppage because TJ Dillashaw, as he told us afterwards and as we saw throughout the fight, had a dislocated shoulder. He dislocated it in April when he started his camp and dislocated it, by his estimation, 20 times throughout the lead to this fight, to the point that he spoke with referee Mark Goddard in the back and said, look, Mark, pretty good chance my shoulder's going to come out. Just don't stop the fight. We'll get it back in. It's just a thing that happens. I said on the live stream yesterday that I think I had a little rant, and I've now subsequently had 24 hours or so to fully calm down about it. I hate every piece of this fight because of the way it played out, because of the fact that it leaves Aljo with no outs as a already maligned champion, because of what it does for the best division in this. Like this, just I still have a sour taste in my mouth about this fight. I understand TJ Dillashaw not wanting to miss this fight, not wanting to be without this opportunity. But at some point, someone along the line, be it his coaches, be it his management, be it the UFC, someone has to step in and say, you are too injured to fairly compete in this fight. Because I don't know about you. I've never dislocated my shoulder. I'm not a professional fighter. But the chances of beating Aljamain Sterling when you're fully healthy are difficult. To do it with one arm seems fairly unwinnable. And that shouldn't happen in the UFC or anywhere for that matter.
Yeah, during the fight, I felt a lot of empathy and a lot of sympathy because again, fighters are taught to never give up. Fighters are taught to overcome any adversity and to believe that they can win on any given day in any given situation. I understand your points, and I think your points are very valid. And I think the point that really tipped me towards your line of thinking is that he came out and he was like, "I'm really sorry to the division because I held up the division." And your point was that, well, actually, this is holding up the division. The taking the fight and doing the fight is holding up the division. Because if in April, when the fight camp started, you knew that your shoulder was bad, pull out and let somebody else take the opportunity, and they'll circle back to you, your TJ Dillashaw. But equally, and I'll go back to the empathy point, he's a 36-year-old. He's coming back off a severe layoff, some bad injuries. He walked into a Corey Sandhagen fight, had a very competitive fight, gets the opportunity at a title shot, does the shoulder, and he might be thinking, look, lads, this might be the last one I get, you know? And if I win this, I either get to ride off into the sunset as a champion and I get to do the things and I can be very happy with calling time on my career like that. Or he thinks if I win this, this is my last ride, you know? And for that, this is why it's a difficult situation for me, because the logical explanation and the logical action to this is corner, wife, team steps in and says, lad, this one ain't the one. Yes, you're 36, but you're still a freak athlete. You're still very good at this fighting thing. Let's sit this one out. Let's get the shoulder sorted, or as sorted as it can be. And we'll talk to the UFC. You're still TJ Dillashaw. They'll circle back. But I can imagine TJ being like, fuck that. I can do this. I can beat this motherfucker.
100%. And I understand I agree, right? There's been a lot of discussion about this, and I understand all of the points of maybe he needed the paycheck. Like, we don't know. Maybe after another year off and another surgery, he's just got to get out there. There's certainly the competitive fire that he wants to feed. All of those things. There's probably pieces of it that they won't come back to me, because if I'm off and I have to have another surgery, maybe it becomes a thing that just I never recover from. And so I go out and I do the thing and we see what happens. I get all of that. And I truly do. I too empathize with the situation he was in. It almost feels to me more like this is where the promotion or his team needs to step in for the fighter himself and find the better remedy to this situation. Because we talk all the time about in-fight fighters aren't going to, they're hurt and somebody comes over and says, hey, are you good to go? And before the doctors are even there, they're like, no, I'm good. We're fighting. And they tell their corner, no, we're still good. At some point, someone has to say, here's the fix to this. Here's the solution. Because this wasn't like, I would understand if he was in the back warming up and threw a kick and twisted weird and blows out his knee and still goes out there. But for it to be a extended camp and a multiple time occurrence feels like someone at some point should have said, hey man, here's the better solution to this, that we can address this in total and all of us together make this decision. Because the other part of it, and I don't know if this will be the case, but it's my belief and my thought that it will be, is that Aljamain Sterling dominated that fight from the outset and looked like he was going to be very dominant. And there will be legions that already don't like Aljo, that already don't think he is a legitimate champion, that go, if TJ wasn't injured, this guy shouldn't be the champ anyway. And now look, he gets to be the champ again. We still got to deal with this guy. And if you're the UFC, that is the last thing you want for one of your champions, especially the champion of what is right now one of your marquee divisions.
Yeah, and this was my secondary point, is actually to Aljo. You know, Aljo coming into this, he's spoken openly about maybe not competing at 135 anymore. He's talked about Merab Dvalishvili and giving up the title so that he can get a crack at it. This man is a man that clearly cares about all the things that champions care about, and that's legacy and money and all of these things. For you to come in and welcome somebody of the stature of TJ Dillashaw, of the history of TJ Dillashaw, and yes, it is marred with the USADA violations and all of the things, but regardless, the skill set that TJ provides is an ominous skill set to face, and an ominous skill set to then go out and look to dominate, and to go out there and in the first wrestling exchange that you get into, which is pretty close into the first round, he blows his arm. And that's heartbreaking for Aljamain Sterling. This is an Aljamain Sterling that's putting in 6 to 12 months of thought and prep into himself, into his own camp. He starts in April, right? A significant amount of time. Comes into this fight fully prepared, fully ready, fully zoned in to compete against a healthy, fit, ready TJ Dillashaw, and instead wins by an injury, essentially. And that, look, he still went in. He did exactly what he needed to do in the opening wrestling exchange. He still managed to get Dillashaw to the mat. He still dumped him. But everything that precedes that will be marred and will be tainted in the public's eyes, and probably in Aljo's eyes too. Because that's not the way that a champion wants to defend his belt.
From a disappointing fight to a surprising fight. Sean O'Malley defeats Petr Yan by split decision. 29-28 across the board, 2 for Sean, 1 for Petr Yan. One thing I want to note before we get into it, and this is by no means a reflection of how I think the fight should have been scored. I haven't rewatched it yet. I'll say that as well. Just a thing I found interesting. Not a soul that put their 10s and 9s on Twitter with the hashtag MMA decisions scored the fight for Sean O'Malley. It's very interesting to me. And I wonder, and I'll, something we can speculate on and discuss at a later date. How much of that is bias? How much of that is preference? I mean, some of that is surely just not, close fight. 29-28 either way is defensible. I'm sure I'll watch this fight again tomorrow and be like, yeah, I can see how everybody got there. We often talk, you and I, on this show about fights telling us stuff, athletes showing us stuff. What did this fight tell you about Sean O'Malley?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just touch slightly on the judging, and I'll just say that if Graham and Sean have a fantastic conversation about it over on the big podcast, so please feel free to go over and listen to that. And both of them scored it differently, which I think is fascinating. And not only is it fascinating, but they also have a very healthy, very regular conversation about it. And they both absolutely concede that at the premise of this, it's a very close fight. And there are a myriad of scorecards that could have been handed in by the judges, and those judges could have been well within their rights to defend those. And Sean makes a very, very interesting point, and a point that I think everyone should think about when they're scoring fights from home, is you don't hear the shots land when you're at home. You don't feel the shots land when you're at home. When you're sat as close as Ben Cartledge and David Letherby and whoever the other judge was, when you're sat that close, Spencer is now doing the Googling thing and going to tell me who the last judge was. But when you're
Vito Palillo.
Thank you, sir.
You're welcome.
When you're sat that close, you get a very, very different sense of what those shots are doing. And that, I think, rings very, very, very true in this.
Before you go on to the Sean part, I want to just underscore this because it's another one of those things that folks like us say regularly in these conversations that I think at times people at home go, well, no, man, if you are anywhere remotely close to a cage when one of these fights is happening and you hear what it actually sounds like to hear a very clean right hand or a very clean body kick or a very sharp low kick, it will change the way you think about these fights. I can still remember the very first UFC event I went to live in Seattle. Johnny Hendricks knocked out TJ Waldberger with a left hand, and it sounded like an absolute, no doubt, 600-foot home run off sweet spot of the bat. And it still echoes in my ear because it's a different sound than you ever understand. And then you see a human being do this.
Yep.
So when Harry says it and Sean and Graham talk about it, please do understand it is a real thing that factors into this.
Absolutely. Shout out to Shoddy Podcasts, legend. What did we learn about Sean O'Malley? Well, we saw, and this is something that I just adore about fighting, and something that I think is one of the, it just refuels my cup for fighting. I talked openly about not really enjoying fighting for a long time, not really enjoying covering the UFC, not really enjoying covering MMA, full stop. But when you see Sean O'Malley with the hair and the face tattoos and everything else go in, and you just see his performance and his true personality just scrubs all that makeup away, and you get to see who he really is. And who he really is a fantastic fighter. To go in, we said at the start, what does he need to do? He needs to force Piotr Jan to respect him. He needs to push Piotr Jan back. He needs to make the feints count. He needs to go through some fire, almost certainly, and he needs to make his opportunities count when he gets them. He did all of that. I thought the get-ups from the grappling were fantastic. I thought he used the moments when he got taken down to rest and to really recoup that energy that was clearly being spent on the feet in what was a very mentally difficult fight as well as a physically difficult fight. I thought that he made all the right decisions on the ground to not give away silly passes, silly mat returns, silly post strips. And then when he got his chance to get up, he got up and defended very, very, very well. I think he punished Piotr Jan for his mistakes. I think he forced Piotr Jan to fight emotionally and to fight in a get-back fashion. And then something happened in the third round. And I was like, ooh, boy. And that was that when Piotr Jan came out, he came out with an extended glove. Piotr Jan is a mean, mean person in there. And he fights mean and he means it. And for him to walk out after that second round with a glove extended, that's a huge, huge personality tell. And if nothing more, Sean O'Malley should earn every single person's respect for a man like Piotr Jan to go out in the third and be like, all right, kid, you've got it. You're good. Let's do the fighting.
I was just going to say, like, I've spoken with Sean in the past, and Sean talking about fighting is very different than Sean talking before doing the fighting. I know you were a very big fan of what he said afterwards and the way he handled that.
We'll get to it.
There's no way to me that you watch this fight and don't come away from it, even if it's begrudgingly, even if you don't like the personality and the flair and the swagger and all of the elements of sugar, without now having begrudging respect and appreciation for Sean O'Malley, the mixed martial artist. Because many people still considered Petr Yan the best bantamweight in the world. And regardless of how you scored it, and we talked about this going into it, Sean O'Malley didn't have to win that fight to have an overall victory. The fact that he won it just makes it even greater to me. He could have landed on the wrong side of that split, and I'd be sitting here saying all the same things, because the skill, the performance, the grittiness that we saw that we haven't had to see from him. And it's one of the things he sort of addressed afterwards as well, of like, I don't like getting hit. I don't want to get hit. But when you get hit, it brings out the trueness of this. And then he went out and showed that in the fire, he's okay. Not only is he okay, but he can rise to the occasion and he can stand being in the flames. And I mean, personality, flamboyance or not, give me everybody that is willing to stand in those flames that are that hot with that dude that, as you said, isn't an easy man to make come out across the corner with one of these where it's like, hey man, we're good. Let's do this for 5 more minutes. Beautiful performance from Sean O'Malley.
A beautiful performance from both of them. You know, like, I think that there again, and this is something that Sean and Graham talked about, and I'll make 2 points, and I'll steal 2 points, and I'll use them here. One is there's an expectation bias, and that expectation was that Petr Yan is going to go in there, show the levels, and blow Sean O'Malley out of the water. So everyone coming out is like, "Fuck me, the Sean O'Malley kid's all right, isn't he?" And not looking at Petr Yan's performance. And Sean made an interesting point, and I've thought about it for a little while now. And he said, "What level did Petr Yan fight at? Was it Petr Yan at the height of his powers?" And I think that that's a very interesting question for the next fight and not this one. Because if Petr Yan goes out, let's say he fights TJ Dillashaw, both coming off a loss, and he absolutely smokes TJ Dillashaw, well then Sean O'Malley's performance looks even better than it did last night. If Petr Yan goes out and fights with the big winging, overarching, overleaning shots that we saw at times in the Sean O'Malley fight, well, we can be like, well, maybe Petr Yan at 33 years old is starting to teeter towards the end of his own career. Maybe that rise of Petr Yan has started to move away. But I think we can only take a fight at its merits. And the fight at its merits was this. Petr Yan was attempting to be vintage Petr Yan. He was trying to walk Sean O'Malley down. He was trying to counter the counters. He was trying to use the grappling. He was trying to mix everything in. But Sean was there for all of it. In the grappling exchange, as soon as he got to the back body lock, my instant reaction was, fuck me, Petr Yan's going to absolutely launch this dude. And Sean O'Malley did a great job of riding with his hips, pummeling his feet back to the inside spaces, being wary of the trips, and fighting the hands. Now, eventually he did get taken down, and these things happen in MMA. But even just the initial reluctance and the initial skill to not get taken down and to not be put on his back immediately in that position was a moral victory. And I think that set the tone for by that time, he'd already had the first round and these things had happened, but I was very impressed with the philosophy and nature with which he approached the fight. It was calm, it was mature, and it was punishing. And those are the things that I did not, and I questioned whether they were in the arsenal in one-man booth. I questioned whether they were there. I said that in the Pedro Munoz fight, he just didn't do enough. And he looked like he just couldn't quite get out of first gear. And he looked like the low kicks were bothering him. And he looked like he couldn't find his range. And he looked like, he just couldn't get to Pedro Munoz. He got to Petr Yan early and often and consistently. Just a really, really good performance.
We do want to get moving forward. I know we're trying to squeeze everything in. Before we leave this fight, what was it about what he said post-fight that you really appreciated the most?
This was, again, unfortunately, he remembered where he was when he was talking at the end and switched it around to say, oh, if the fans want me to win a title, I'll fucking, I'll win a title. We'll give the fans what they want and whatever, horse shit, whatever. But DC asked him, do you want a title shot? Essentially, I can't remember specifically how he worded it, but he said, do you want a title shot? And O'Malley looked at DC, looked at the camera, and sort of shrugged his shoulders, looked deflated, and was like, I guess I'll have to watch the fight back. Motherfucker, you just fought Piotr Jan for 15 minutes, looked really good, and you're upset with your performance. That's a dude I can ride with. That's a dude that knows who he is. That's a dude that set very lofty expectations of himself. That's a dude that holds himself to an extremely high standard. That's a dude that really understands what he wants from this game. And to go out there after having fought nowhere near the level of competition of a Piotr Jan, to look average against Pedro Munoz, to take this fight. The only other upper echelon fight you fought is Chito Vera, and we know how that went. To be coming off a Raulian Paiva destruction, and he walks in against Piotr Jan and is pissed off with his performance. Brilliant. Brilliant. Give me all that.
Yeah.
All of that.
As I said, when you talk to Sean O'Malley and you talk to him about fighting and his aspirations and his focus as a martial artist, never mind mixed martial artist, that's the guy you get. And that's the guy that's easy to root for and easy to cheer for and easy to fall in love with. It's all the peripheral stuff. It's all the extra that can be the decisive part. There is no more doubting this man's skill, talent, commitment, focus, all of those things. We move forward to the lightweights. Beneil Dariush gets a unanimous decision win over Mateusz Gamrot in a fight that was dictated by just an absolute phenomenal mid-fight decision by Beneil Dariush to forgo getting in these grappling exchanges. I'm just not going to do this first round. It was close. I'm not doing this anymore. You come to me, and when you come to me, I got this right here for you. Come taste this, fella. And Mateusz Gamrot, like, to his credit, took a bunch of them and waded through a bunch of them. But at the end of the day, the winning streak is 8. Beneil Dariush is, to my eyes, the number one contender in the lightweight division. And he looked good yet again. Like, just another great performance from a guy that continues to sort of feel still a little bit unheralded. You loved this fight. You loved the adjustments. Tell me why.
I really, really enjoyed Dariush's overall intelligence here. Shawnee and I talked about this on the preview show. We went back and forth on Twitter on the night. And I think that the fight told me that both of us were correct, actually. That Mateusz Gamrot looked certainly the sharper, quicker athlete on the feet in the opening stanza. Dariush was getting involved in scrambles that he didn't seem supremely comfortable to be in. He was getting involved in scrambles that he wasn't initiating. He was getting embroiled in the Gamrot game plan. And then he comes out in round 2 and says, you know what? I'm actually quite intelligent in this fighting thing, and I don't actually have to do this shit. What I could do is just let him come to me and then fucking smash him every time he comes. And Gamrot wasn't able to adjust from the adjustment. On the live stream, we said first round was a clear Gamrot round. The second round was a clear Dariush round. And we said that we're going to find out a lot about Mateusz Gamrot in this third round, who he is, how does he make his own adjustments? And the answer was he just couldn't. He just couldn't make them against Benny Daggers. And, you know, I said on the preview show, and I stand by this, I absolutely loved and love both fighters. I love their fighting styles. I love what they bring. And I was very sad to see either of them lose. But what we saw was why Beneil Dariush is an elite level fighter and why Mateusz Gamrot has a little bit to evolve until he gets there. And that is the same reason why I lauded Piotr Jan in the one-man booth. is his ability to make reads and adjustments based on the fight. And I think that that's like the final skill set that you unlock as an elite level fighter, or at least it's the thing that you hone to the greatest degree as an elite level fighter, is the ability to go into a fight, have a game plan, realize that it's either working really well and sticking to it or not working well at all, and either taking direction from your corner and implementing it or figuring it out yourself in the heat of the moment and going out and changing the fight. And that's exactly what Beneil Dariush did, and he did it to fantastic effect. And I can't congratulate him enough for that. Supreme level fight IQ.
Yeah, it as something we talk about regularly here on this show. The fight IQ, the adjustment piece of it is just, it's the thing that, I mean, look, we talked on the preview show, and the argument that sort of you and Sean had and throughout was that Mateusz Gamrot was the better athlete. He argued the Dariush side. I agree fully that, still stand by the fact that I think Gamrot is the greater athlete. This was one of those times where the greater athlete didn't win because the more cerebral fighter went out and did the things that the more cerebral fighter needs to do in those situations. And it's why we shake our head and throw our hands up at bad fight IQ every week on this program. It is such a critical piece of this sport. It is such a critical piece of success. Beneil Dariush showed that on Saturday to get his 8th straight win. I don't know what's next for him in the division because clearly, as we talked about, it looks like Alexander Volkanovski is next in that division. But whatever it is well earned. And Beneil Dariush is an absolute fucking force in this division.
Big savage.
We get to the main card opener. Manon Fiorot defeats Katlyn Chookagian, 29-28 across the board. Not that I want to like hustle past this one and not give it full time. It played out the way we thought it would. Both fighters at range. Both fighters kind of throw in. I went into it thinking Manon Fiorot was a bit of the evolution or growth of Katlyn Chookagian, just in terms of the power, in terms of the physicality overall. I think that played out. We saw a little bit of Chookagian not having a secondary game plan. You talked throughout the live stream of love to see her mix in a takedown, love to see her mix in a level change, just to throw something else in there. It didn't come, and it was a kickboxing match. And full marks to Manon Fiorot for doing what very few people do in beating Katlyn Chookagian. I think it does probably set up a championship opportunity. May not be next. Taila Santos, we still don't know what Valentina Shevchenko is going to do. But my big takeaway, and I said it on the live stream after this fight, was all this did for me was confirm that Valentina Shevchenko is an absolute savage and that she's going to thrash Manon Fiorot whenever she gets in there with her.
So I disagree that it went the way that we thought it was going to. I was vastly impressed with Katlyn Chookagian's performance. In a losing performance, fine. And it went the way that we thought. I can't remember who specifically said it. There was lots of conversations about this card. But somebody said that they think the power, or many people said that they think the power differential was going to be with Katlyn Chookagian, and that turned out to be the case. But I was so impressed with Chookagian's aggression and willingness to get in there and produce a forward fighting game plan. So often in her fights, we've seen her be able to canter around the cage and force her opponents to come onto them and then land jamming shots or counter shots or use her range to be able to dictate how the fight goes. In this one, I think she realized that that was not going to play out well and instead tried to force Manon Fiorot back and tried to force Manon Fiorot to think about sitting down on her shots and landing with power, and did so really effectively. I think that there are some portions of Chookagian's game in the head movement and in the exit of the pockets after she's thrown her shots that could be better and probably will never get better because this is the fighter that Katlyn Chookagian is. But I was very, very impressed with her willingness to change her game plan and to go out and to put it all on the line.
Excellent use of the word canter. We move to the final prelim of the night. Beneil Dariush gets a second round technical knockout win over Sean Brady in a tremendous performance.
Belal Muhammad.
Who did I say?
Beneil Dariush.
Oh, my apologies. God damn that. See, and Bilal's going to be like, you motherfuckers never remember. Trying to remember the name, Belal. I'm sorry. Full apologies. Belal Muhammad goes out and bounces Sean Brady from the ranks of the unbeaten with a second round TKO finish. And this is, we said going in that this is a difficult fight, that this is a fight that absolutely Belal Muhammad can win, that Sean Brady has to do certain things, has to answer certain questions. At a point in, I feel like even midway through the first round, it felt like Belal Muhammad was just like, all right, cool. I'm here. Now I'm going to take control of this. I'm not going to let you back me up. I'm going to get into my game. And then in the second, he was like, let me just see what happens when I turn up the Belal Muhammad a little bit more. And Sean Brady didn't have an answer. He didn't have, he didn't like getting hit. I know you have some thoughts about this fight, so we'll get to those. Seemed to me like he didn't like getting hit. He didn't like working backwards. He didn't like the pressure. And something we talk about all the time, you can't just be comfortable being the hammer to succeed at the highest level of this sport. And I wonder a little bit if there's a little bit of gotta learn to be the nail in there for Sean Brady.
I don't know.
Fair. Fair.
Because I actually think Belal had a bit of the Dariush in him, in that the first couple of stanzas in the opening round, Brady was landing the harder, more impactful, longer ranging combinations, and Belal was not able to get his forward pressure going. Belal was not able to do the things that we are encumbered by when we watch Belal. And that is pushing forward, circling well, cutting the cage off nicely, leaping in with his shots, and doing a good job of circling out the back door and keeping himself safe. He wasn't able to do that. Brady was catching him and catching him really, really well. And I feel like Dariush, Belal made an adjustment, but he just made it quicker. And that was that if I just slip the first shot and come in with a 2 and a 3, the answers aren't the same from Brady. And I don't even necessarily think that it was him turning up the Belal in the second round. I just think that the rest of the first round, he adopted a new game plan, tested it. The test came back successful. So he was like, okay, I'll just shell a bit more coin into the arcade machine and I'll use the same combination buttons and I'll just get this motherfucker out of here. And it felt just like that. We know that one of Belal's star qualities is that he's a little bit like a steam train. That when you push him and he has to get grinding and eventually his wheels start turning, it can be dicey. But when he gets going, boy, oh boy, he's a motherfucker to deal with and a motherfucker to slow down. And I just thought that the execution and the shot selection was gorgeous. I would have been happy with an earlier stoppage, frankly. And the thoughts that you were talking about, and I'll close out on this, is it feels like Sean Brady may have come in with an injury. It feels like Sean Brady may have come in a little bit banged up. Maybe the nose looked a little bit off, and I know the nose was off against Chiesa, but it looked a little bit off, and it looked like when Belal caught him with a couple of shots early, the nose looks more off than it did before, so maybe it's a bit brittle. And there was seemingly a tiny mouse and a little bit of a bruise underneath Brady's eye as he was walking to the cage. Not sure what happened there. And as I say, I know these guys come in banged up all the time, but going in against somebody like Belal, you don't want to be coming in having taken a couple of smacks, even in fight week, you know?
Yeah, it's very interesting, and I would like to find out. That's another one of those. I hope whoever talks to Sean Brady next asks some of those questions, because he did look like he had caught 1 or 2 clean shots in the back or somewhere in the hotel during the week. And I would like to know about the nose, whether we're looking at almost a Rory McDonald thing, right? Where the nose is just so brittle and so broken so many times that maybe this is a permanent problematic thing. You could still compete, you could still be very good, but it's going to limit your overall upside. The other thing here is Bilal Muhammad is just, to me, he's in that position now, and it's a very unenviable position. He took the big risk here in fighting backwards. The reward of it was that if you go out and beat the undefeated guy that entered this fight as the betting favorite, it just elevates your status even more. He is now on a 4-fight winning streak, unbeaten in 9, and I don't know what happens next for him. And that feels like one of those things we talk about regularly. Sean and I talk about when we do the state of the UFC addresses. We shouldn't have situations like this where a guy that is in the top 5 gets a victory of this magnitude and isn't fighting for a title next, and may not, to the bet Ian and I made on the live stream on Saturday, fight for the title this year, which is unconscionable to me. Because after a performance like that and the wins he's put up, that dude merits fighting for a title.
Yeah, I don't really have much else to say on that. I really agree. And yeah, if I say what I have in my mind, I'll be repeating things that we've said 1,000 times. So yeah,
yep. We will move on. We will get out of here on this. What is, if anything, something else on these prelims that we haven't touched on yet that really spoke to you, that really stood out to you, that really is a piece that you are looking to dissect more going forward, I guess?
We learned a lot about Sean O'Malley's character, his true character, in his performance against Piotr Jan. And I think we did the same with Muhammad Mokaev's performance against Malcolm Gordon. I think Mokaev, and I should say this very carefully, I think Muhammad Mokaev should believe in who he is more. We've seen the lauding and the goading and the showboating in a number of his amateur fights, and we've seen some of it now in his professional fights. But fighting an amateur and fighting up the ranks in the UFC are very, very, very different things. And there were moments of adversity that we haven't seen in Mokaev's professional career. We haven't really seen in his amateur career either. So we learned a little bit about how he deals with adversity. We learned about his positional awareness in bad spots, and the answer is pretty fucking good. But we also, I think, saw an element of his true character, not the character that is elevated to 11 to entertain fans in a fighting scenario. And that true character was the guy with a minute left in the 3rd round and was like, fuck, I should probably just finish this guy now. And there were moments after the adversity, I think in the 2nd or the 1st, I can't quite remember, where you could see that he came out and tried to prove a point. And when he tries to prove a point, he was dominant and he was damaging and he was very, very good. And I don't feel like going out and playing up to a character or playing up to the person that you think the fans would like you to be is going to stand you in good stead as you reach ranked numbers. When you look at Sean O'Malley, there was 0 trash talk. There was 0 character after the door was locked. Prior to that, he's doing this stuff in the middle of the cage. He's lauding himself and his fans. And then the cage door closes and that motherfucker's eyes glaze over and it's fight time now. Now, that character doesn't exist and it's just 2 men moving and competing and sharing skills. And I think for Muhammad Mokaev, he should believe in who he really is and do all of the character stuff when the cage door's unlocked.
That feels like a perfect way to wrap this up. This has been the Next Day Takeaways for UFC 280. Please go and check out the Severe Spotlight written by my guy, Harry Powell, coming out on Monday. Follow him on Twitter, Instagram, everything at BJJ_Harry Powell. Check out the Severe YouTube page where you will find this and all of our stuff. Check out the Severe Patreon page. Go and listen to The Big Show with Sean and Graham. It is it's phenomenal week to week. It's extra phenomenal this week. Check out everything that comes out this week. I will be on Hot Topic with Andy Stevenson later in the week. I'm sure we'll have a speaker's corner, like all kinds of stuff. Old Triangle is back this week as well. The other part of this is that we just keep rolling. We roll into Calvin Kattar and Arnold Allen. To start that off, I will have a in-depth conversation with Calvin Kattar's head coach, Tyson Chartier, on a series that is debuting tomorrow called A Conversation With. It is a series I'm very much looking forward to. It's not just about fights. It's not just about what's happening right now. It's about the journey of these people that are involved in the sport, because it's not just going to be fighters and coaches. It's going to be everybody and anybody that I can get my hands on. And then the rest of these gentlemen can get their hands on as well. I think these are the stories that people want to hear. I hope they're the stories and the interviews that people want to hear, because they're the things that I want to do the most. And I'm grateful to Severe for giving me the opportunity to do them. So please check that out tomorrow. For Harry, I am Spencer. Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. We love you. We appreciate you. Have a great week. Take care of yourselves. Take care of one another. We'll talk to you soon.